Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We're now going to look at the second day in the preliminary hearing for Chair Daybell. As far as I'm concerned, it was fireworks from the word go. As far as I'm concerned, day two totally eclipsed day one. Even despite those sort of audio clips of Lori and also the secret recording of Melanie, this cross-examination of Melanie was, for me, fascinating to watch. It was also riveting. It was very interesting how the defense attorney prior sort of went about his strategy. Before I get into that, I've taken quite a lot of notes. I want to play a couple of minutes of the opening, and then I will provide a little bit of analysis. So stand by just to listen to about the first 2 or 3 minutes of the opening for day two.
This is the second day of the preliminary hearing set in this matter here in Fremont County, Idaho. My name is Judge Edens. Last night, at the end of the day, we finished up with the direct examination of the witness Melanie Gibb, and it's my understanding we're going to start with the cross-examination of that witness. Is that correct, Mr. Wood?
I believe so, Your Honor.
Ms. Gibb, if you'll please come forward. Ms. Gibb, with the new day, will swear you in here again.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in the cause now can be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Yes, thank you.
Ms. Gibb, you can be seated there in that witness chair. If you'll pull that microphone up to your chin and aim it at your chin again. Mr. Pryor, you may inquire on cross-examination when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Pryor, in looking at some of the recording last night, I noticed that the one audio that we couldn't hear very well was yours. So again, if you don't mind making your microphone look like this, it will record it a lot better if it's pointed at your chin. I know it looks weird. That's the way to do it.
Okay, thank you, Judge. Can you hear me now?
I can.
And Ms. Gibbs, can you hear me as well?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Gibbs, Ms. Gibb, I apologize. When did you first meet Mr. Daybell?
About, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, if I reflect that the information I have is that you were at a preparedness camp in July of 2017 in Ogden, Utah. Is that correct?
In Morgan, Utah. Yes, that's correct.
Morgan, Utah?
Mm-hmm.
Is Morgan close to Ogden?
Yes.
Okay, okay. And would you explain to me what a preparedness camp is?
It was a
Objection,
camp.
relevance.
Mr. Pryor's been an objection as to relevance.
Well, Judge, there was testimony that they met. I think I can inquire as to the nature of that relationship and what they were both there for, and I don't think it's necessarily irrelevant that there's a discussion. It's much like we went to a concert or we went to a play. It's the same thing. I think I'm allowed to inquire about that. I don't see that that's necessarily irrelevant.
I'll overrule the objection. You may continue with that question, Mr. Pryor.
And again, ma'am, before Mr. Wood injected his objection, there was a question about what is a preparedness camp?
It's a camp where people get together, families and individuals, where they're learning about how to cook outside or how to filter water or different preparedness skills.
Preparedness for what?
For if there's times where you may not have those types of things readily available to you, that you could learn to do it if you didn't have electricity, things like that.
Okay, well, I noticed when I was listening to your tape, and obviously I've heard that before, there were some religious references on that tape between you and Miss Vallow. And I'm just curious as to whether this preparedness camp has any kind of a religious undertone as well.
Objection, relevance.
Overruled. I think there was a lot of religious undertones that were put forth yesterday. I'm going to allow Mr. Pryor to go down this road in a limited way here today. I'm going to allow that question.
And then
So I'm not sure if it was the prosecutor's intention to sort of start off by interrupting the defense counsel right off the bat, and whether or not it was justified just to rattle the guy, just to throw him off his game. In other words, to interrupt him without necessarily having a good reason to do it. But the first objection was overruled, not a good start for the prosecutor. And then the second one I thought was actually quite ridiculous. I thought it was quite ridiculous that the prosecutor was trying to say that religious aspects were irrelevant. I mean, that was his objection relevance. It's hard to think of a case where the religious beliefs of the people involved is more relevant than this particular case. I mean, it's just crazy. So again, I don't know whether the prosecutor just sort of made a note to himself like object, and just rattle the defense attorney and then sit back. Maybe if you can upset him and derail him in the first few minutes, then you will have done your job for the rest of his thing. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is I've sat in on a couple of trials, and a lot of attorneys have different styles. And what I mean is they will sometimes allow a court day to end without saying anything, and sometimes they will make sure that they get the last word. In other words, almost to leave a strong, almost psychological aroma in your mind, so that you leave the court, or your last sort of residual memory is out of that person's mouth. In other words, he gets the last word, right? Now, there's some interesting strategies with that. Sometimes you get in the last word and you kind of put in a counter punch. But on this occasion, it looks like the defense counsel kind of thought, this has been a pretty incredible punch, this audio, the secret audio from Melanie. I'm going to go home and I'm going to prepare, and I'm going to hit this witness hard. And you may not think so. You might think that the attorney sort of went home and sort of just got up with his notes the next day and started his cross-examination. But that's not the case at all. You can bet that he worked late into the night. He formulated a strategy. What he wanted to do was actually start with a bang. He wanted to start with his strongest point. And what he needs to do is he needs to discredit this prosecution witness. He needs to make her look bad. He needs to emphasize errors that she made. He needs to say the word lie as often as possible. Lie, you lied, and what did you do after the lie? And so that's another thing. And he needs to also almost do it in a nice way, where the witness doesn't just say, I can't recall. She must also sort of respond to him, be somewhat communicative, but he nevertheless needs to kind of get his pound of flesh, and that's the point here. Now, I'm sure that there are a lot of people who feel that they don't like this defense attorney. As someone else said, he's just doing his job. He's doing it pretty well. He's doing his job pretty well. It's hard not to feel feelings of anger and dislike just because of the hypocrisy. He's representing a guy, and now he's asking questions about religious beliefs from someone who's certainly not as visionary, if that's the word, and much of a zealot as Chad Daybell. He's written books. He's changed lives. He has had visions, and so on. And so to kind of attack Melanie on the same question is kind of a bit two-faced, wouldn't you say? So I've kind of prepared a couple of notes, and I'm going to kind of go through them as systematically as I can. And I want to start off with, I will get to the religious aspect, but there are a couple of basic trial things that I want to just sort of emphasize before we get to that. So over the past 2 days or so, there was a hearing before this one, and I spoke about how they've coordinated their wardrobe. What I noticed today is that their hairstyles are exactly the same as well, where in other words, they both are sort of silver foxes. I don't think that word really comes to mind with Chad Daybell, but anyway, he's sort of graying, and it looks like today he used the same comb and sort of brill cream as his lawyer. His hairstyle just looks a lot more, looks a lot similar to the man sitting next to him. What's also interesting is they're both wearing a white shirt. Okay, that's not a huge stretch. Their ties are different, but you might notice that almost from a distance, Mr. Pryor's tie sort of looks yellow or khaki, and that's the same color as Chad Daybell's pants. It does feel like it's stretching a little bit too far now that they're coordinating their wardrobe, but both of their ties now are quite sort of, there's quite a lot going on their ties, if I can put it that way. In terms of Melanie, I mean, I just couldn't help noticing that she looked quite attractive in her sort of pink jacket and white blouse. She is actually quite an attractive woman. She's got striking blue eyes, blonde hair, almost like a typical American beauty in a way. And there are moments where she's quite curt, there are moments where she's quite sweet, there's moments where she's flustered, and there are moments where she seems to be, I don't know, like quite pensive. She sort of looks down. I found this a really fascinating interrogation. So to start off with the audio, this is something that is ridiculous in courtrooms, that you have a situation where you can't quite hear somebody speaking, and then you tell them, and you tell them again, and you tell them again, and you tell them again. And it's a ridiculous thing that in the 21st century that you struggle to hear what a person is saying. And in this particular session, even though the judge tells Pryor to move the microphone right in the beginning, and even though he does do it, in fact, Chad Daybell kind of leans over with a kind of a helpful smile and sort of bends the mic for him. Even though he does that, Chad Daybell also tells his client that it's actually it's Gibb. He calls her Gibbs, and Chad helps him out with Gibb. And it sort of, one also wonders, was that intentional? You know, Chad being the nice guy, Chad being the helpful guy. But it's hard to imagine that it's not, because so much of this is stage managed. But what is just really weird is how even Melanie has got to tell him to speak up because she can't hear him. And then you kind of have the weird thing where the defense attorney says, do you have an auditory problem? And I've sat in on other trials where the same thing kind of happens. You just can't hear what the people are saying. Now, as I say, it's an absolutely ridiculous state of affairs. How hard is it to speak and use a microphone and have somebody communicate on trial in a way that everyone can simply just hear what is being said? If the person isn't speaking up, all you do is you have somebody put the mic closer to the person and you turn up the volume. How hard is that to do? And yet it happens again and again and again. And now you must bear in mind what a shame it is. You know, a lot of work goes into a trial. It's not just the witness that's on the stand and the judge that's, got to schedule it or whatever, and the time that it's taken to make make this court time available and the courtroom available. It's not just the prosecutor that's been working on the case. There's an army of other people involved. There's an army of paralegals, there's an army of investigators, detectives, policemen. And then you can kind of have critical evidence simply just misheard. It happens a lot. Somebody thought they heard something, because they misheard it, it comes out in the verdict, or it comes out later on that was misunderstood because somebody misheard it. It's a very regrettable thing in trials, but it happens all the time. Miscommunication, misunderstanding. And again, it just beggars belief that in the 21st century, you have something as simple as an audio problem. And even in this trial day, preliminary hearing day 2, there were moments where you just couldn't really hear prior very well. It's something that they need to sort of take the bull by the horns and sort out right in the beginning. Make sure that it's absolutely clear. You also had prior sort of not mumbling, but sort of interrupting himself and interrupting the witness. That also causes sort of a garbled outcome. I just want to emphasize this. You have one chance to hear a case. Sometimes you have an appeal, but essentially a case is fielded once. And you've got one time to present your case clearly and effectively. And so a dumb thing like not being able to hear is a really crappy reason to have an outcome frustrated or compromised. So I want to now touch on the actual substance of day 2. Like I say, I was absolutely gobsmacked when the prosecutor said, wow, religious undertones, I think that's irrelevant. Yesterday when I listened to the first day of the preliminary hearing, I was kind of like waiting for somebody to say the word Mormon or God but just sort of acknowledging what was actually happening, their faith. This is actually the true currency overshadowing, underlining, running through all of these people. It's idiosyncratic to this case, and you kind of had that just not acknowledged for quite a long time on day 1. And so that's why I say it's quite ironic, but kind of in a way that, I don't know, pissed me off, where you have the defense attorney coming in and saying, I'm going to start this day by pointing the finger at her and saying, what are your beliefs? What do you believe? Aren't your beliefs a little bit strange? Well, what about the guy sitting next to you? What about the guy sitting next to you who thinks of himself as a deity? This is what was said on the Dateline thing by Melanie. This guy thinks he's a deity, who thinks he's had so many lives before, who thought he was married to Lori Vallow before, who thought that, I think he was Methuselah in a previous life, and was it Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? I'm not quite sure, but one of those people. You've got this kind of religious fruitcake sitting next to you, and now you're attacking the person in front of you who actually kind of had an attack of conscience or a feeling of, wow, this isn't right, what's going on. I just find that sort of hypocrisy of it frustrating. This is about a cult, a religious cult that went badly wrong. And now you have this person talking to someone who kind of woke up out of that hypnosis. But anyway, to say that the religious thing is irrelevant, that's totally not true. It's absolutely relevant. The interesting thing also is the defense attorneys playing with the witness. He's kind of saying, what do you mean by this preparedness camp? Can you tell me a little bit about the preparedness camp? And so what you hear from Melanie, and I think a lot of people are listening to this, and they know what the defense attorney's asking, and they know how Melanie's answering it. And this is what I mean. He's saying, what is this preparedness camp? Now, I think almost everybody listening, including the judge, including the prosecutor, including you and me, is kind of thinking, okay, I know what that's about. When Melanie answers it, she sort of says, well, we learn how to make fires, and if it's a situation where you don't have those things available. And because she doesn't address it fully, in other words, she doesn't say, we're preparing for doomsday, we're preparing for the end of the world, we're preparing for the apocalypse, we're preparing for the return of Christ, we're preparing for the 144,000, we're preparing for the, all of that stuff. Because she doesn't say that, everyone's kind of thinking, wow, she didn't really say that. Can we rely on her? Is she being completely honest? And that is exactly the seed that was intended to be laid right in the beginning, where you kind of go, uh-oh, I don't know whether we should believe everything she says. And that is the exact, I think, thing that the defense attorney was aiming at when he prepared for this day. That is the counter punch that he wanted. He wanted to start really strongly, and he did. He didn't press her to say, okay, so but a preparedness camp for what exactly? He allowed the fact that she didn't address it precisely to linger in the minds of his audience. Does that make sense? And that shows a very clever defense lawyer, a very sly, very clever defense lawyer. So what he's trying to do is trying to undermine her. Melanie's recording has been very damaging to his client. In fact, she recorded Chad saying something like, I predicted, or I saw a vision, I knew Tammy was going to decline or die for 3 years, and she sort of just slowly got weaker and weaker, and then she died. That's kind of what he says. So that recording is very damaging, and now his lawyer's got to kind of repair the damage, and one of the best ways to do it is to show up the witness, to make her seem strange, crazy, weird, strange beliefs, unreliable, a liar, and so on. So again, to object to the relevance of that just beggared belief, no wonder the judge overruled it. There's a point where Pryor got like really angry, which is quite interesting. There was definitely fireworks. There was a question that he was trying to sort of raise where, I think he sort of asked Melanie, did you commit adultery, or were you living with? It was quite clever. She didn't sort of answer the question. Then he said, are you living with? I think it's Dave Warwick, and she said something like no, or not at the moment. I can't quite remember what she said, and then he said, and this was quite clever, he said, where does David Warwick reside? And then she said kind of where it was, and then he said, where do you reside? Which is kind of another sly way of putting it in the audience's mind what he's suggesting. And I think at this point Melanie kind of flushed. She seemed kind of flustered, but she also seemed kind of quite embarrassed. And what is interesting about this is these people are all about God, they're about morality, they're about God's visions and God's will and all that kind of thing, and yet there's this incredible convenience with regard to being with whoever you want to be with, whether they're married or not or whatever. And that is kind of a hypocrisy, an obvious hypocrisy that one can sort of look at this from a distance. That you have these people with these very ardent beliefs, and they prescribe beliefs to other people, and yet kind of to themselves they are law of their own, seems to be. I think the biggest shock to me on day 2 was the admission from Melanie that she kind of didn't get along with Lori's kids. So when you think about that, the fact that even her children didn't seem to like her, she just sort of puts it as they didn't have a relationship with her, but it's kind of more than that. It's almost like I think Tylee specifically didn't like Melanie. Now, I think you've got to ask the question why. Why would Tylee not like Melanie? And I think I can answer the question. I don't know the answers, I'm speculating, but I would speculate that when Melanie came into Lori's life, this is just a guess, Lori became a kind of believer that started to make Tylee's life not very fun. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, you're a zombie, you're this, you're that. And in other words, you have a situation where these new folks coming into Lori's life would then lead to prohibitive and prescriptive things on how a young teenage girl can behave. But then look at how these people are behaving. Murder, adultery, lying, all of it ending up in a court case, and then these children themselves being murdered as well. And you've got to ask the question, why wasn't this reported earlier? And I think if Melanie had a really close, good relationship with the children, then I think she would have cared a lot more about them. I think she cared about them as a human being, but I think she also cared about them as, I don't want to get into trouble. I want to preserve my reputation. What are other people going to think? I don't know how much of it was, I really care about JJ as a person because I like him. I think he's a sweet kid. I really like Tylee. She likes me. I wonder if she's okay. I think there was that on a basic level, but I don't think there was that on a sort of a genuine level where it's almost like a friend and you think about them often. I really don't think it was like that. And so in that sense, because they didn't have such a great relationship, is Melanie really going to make a big fuss when they disappear? So if you go on, what I also found quite interesting was that Pryor describes Lori to Melanie as persuasive, dynamic, and convincing. All of those are kind of positive terms. Persuasive, dynamic, and convincing. But in the context of like a cult or people becoming delusional and all the circumstances of this case where there might be a conspiracy where someone could have murdered someone else, asked someone to murder someone else, whatever, being persuasive, dynamic, and convincing is not good. And one wonders how Pryor would describe his client. Is Chad persuasive, dynamic, and convincing? I think there are aspects of that, but I also think Chad is nervous. I think he's hesitant. I think he lacks confidence. He lacks basic confidence. I think he's got kind of a super ego, God complex kind of thing going. But I also think he's persuasive. I think he's probably quite a persuasive author. I'm not sure if I would call him dynamic. Lori seems to have that kind of energy. Chad, I'm not sure if he's dynamic. I think I would think of Chad more as opportunistic, an opportunistic gravedigger. But again, I found it shocking that it's something that is unfortunate that Melanie didn't just volunteer to say, I didn't actually get along with her children. They were secular or something. They didn't actually believe what we believed. We were kind of at loggerheads, and I don't know if that's the case. Maybe they did believe it. But if you can just be honest and say, I feel a bit conflicted about this because we didn't actually get along that well, but I'm actually devastated that that this happened to them. It's really tragic. It's really unfortunate. I wish I could have done something. And this whole thing of Lori wanting Melanie to take a photo of sort of random children plays into this whole thing that I think Lori knew that Melanie didn't care too much about JJ. Put it this way, she didn't care much. She would have cared more about JJ if JJ adored her and she adored JJ. But JJ didn't adore her and she didn't adore JJ. So if something, I won't say if something happened to JJ, but if where JJ wasn't clear, Melanie might not necessarily care that much about it. Something that was also interesting is, but I kind of felt that Melanie was justified when she was asked, are you guys almost sisters? Are you and Lori almost sisters? They didn't know each other that long. They did seem to get along like a house on fire really quickly, but that does seem to be a bit of an exaggeration. Another thing that's interesting is Alex Cox was referred to as Al by Lori. It's just quite interesting, again, just to emphasize that Melanie had to say to the defense counsel a couple of times, can you speak closer to your mic? Then there was a really interesting moment where he spoke about how long did it take you after you lied to the Gilbert police that you had JJ with you? She never did. Before you contacted them to say, actually I don't know where he is, or he's with Lori or something like that. And I think she said it was 10 to 12 days. So for 10 to 12 days, the police seemed to be under the assumption that JJ was with Melanie. If I understand this correctly, what happened was Lori asked Melanie to lie about JJ being there because the police were going to call, and when the police did call, that's exactly what she did. Melanie did lie. And what that kind of suggests is that for a brief period, Melanie was actually complicit. She was part of this kind of conspiracy. And then she wasn't. Then she stopped. And the defense attorney kind of says, when did you come into town? Who did you speak to? When did you speak to the FBI? He made quite a big fuss about that. Don't you remember talking to the FBI? Do you speak to the FBI often that you can't remember when you spoke to them? And then she was asked, did you make a deal with the prosecutor that they're not going to prosecute you in exchange for some kind of immunity? If you become a state's witness, we won't press charges against you. And she said, I think she said no, never. It was never offered. I'm not going to take it further than that. It's been about half an hour. But I just want to again emphasize that I think a major sort of flaw, a major reason why this case frustrated the law enforcement for as long as it did, what made it more complicated, bear in mind, in the same way that Melanie has basically been the star of the prosecution and the investigation, she could have kind of been the shining star much, much earlier. In fact, she could have prevented the body count from being, if it was 4, she could have made it 1 if she'd spoken up sooner. If she'd seen the light, so to speak, sooner. And it seems as if the fact that she didn't have a terribly good relationship with Lori's kids, and perhaps her situation with David Warwick made her reluctant to come forward herself. Like, I don't want to be under scrutiny. This isn't right, but I don't really want to have my life under investigation. and but then another person dies, but then another person dies. If you found this analysis interesting and useful, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.